Welcome into another episode of her Game Plans Fantasy Hot or Not list, where we break down the fantasy football game so you can play the field and own the game in not only the NFL but in fantasy football. Now, fantasy football in week 10 was not my week because I not only lost in one league or two or three or four. Actually, I did lose in all four. I'm in 4 leagues and I lost in all 4. Not a great week for me. And if you remember last week, I said that I was playing against Garrett, my beloved boyfriend, in 2 leagues. And if you do the math, that means I lost to him in both leagues. We're fine. Everything's fine. Really having some confidence in my team this week. DK Metcalf, I'm speaking to you and manifesting to you. Please come back and play this week. Please. Please, 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 please. Anyways, we've got some buys this week, and we've got an episode that is going to help you get in contention for those playoffs so you can take home the fantasy football trophy in your leagues. Bye weeks, we have Arizona Cardinals, Carolina Panthers, New York Giants, and Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think the 2 teams that hurt the most for fantasy are the Cardinals and the Bucs, so make sure you're hitting that waiver wire and picking up players that you could either put on your bench or in your starting lineups this week if you are missing some guys who are on bye. Now, I usually jump into fantasy football fundamentals, but we've learned a lot this season. So now we're going to get into a new segment because last week we did first half fantasy honors, and now we're going to get into our new segment called the Underachievers Club. Welcome to the Underachievers Club, where we talk about players who were supposed to bring all the fantasy glory, but, well, they left us hanging. So each week, I'll choose a player or 2 who have been underperforming relative to expectations and dive into why they are underachieving. And, I'll give a little backstory on how they were drafted and how they're performing and why they've unfortunately been inducted to the Underachievers Club for the 2024 season. Alrighty, let's talk about our first inductee into the Underachievers Club, and it's going to be Dolphins wide receiver Tyreek Hill. Let's talk about why. In most leagues, he was drafted in the top 5. In one of my leagues, he was the first overall pick in our fantasy draft. This is the reason why he's on the Underachievers Club is because he's the number 30 receiver on the season. Now let's talk about why he was drafted in the top 5. Well, because this man in his 9 seasons in the NFL has not fallen out of the top 8 wide receivers in 6 of those 9 seasons. Last year he caught for 1,799 yards and had, Let me double check. 13 touchdowns on the season. The man puts up ridiculous numbers and is incredibly fast. Well, this year, he has 1 touchdown in, 9 games. He's played all games. His best game was his first game this season against the Jacksonville Jaguars, where he caught 7 receptions for 130 yards and a touchdown. And everybody's like, oh, Tyreek Hill is, he's going to continue doing Tyreek Hill things. He's going to keep doing cheetah things. Well, his best game since then, well, he caught a touchdown this past week. So, congrats, Tyreek Hill. But he only had 3 catches for 16 yards and a touchdown. His best game outside of that looks like 4 catches for 80 yards. He had another game for 6 catches for 69 yards on 10 targets. I mean, we do have to factor in that Tua Tagovailoa has been out for a lot of the season because of the concussion protocol that he had to go through and the scary situation that happened with him. And also Tyreek Hill is playing with a torn ligament in his wrist because he had a whole, there's controversy earlier this season where he was arrested by the police for apparently speeding or going past a sign, but basically, got off with nothing because there was nothing that really happened for him to get arrested, but it did cause him to tear a ligament in his wrist. So, Tyreek Hill, unfortunately, you are our first inductee into the Underachievers Club. Not a club we want to be in, but hopefully By the end of the season, this gives you motivation. I know, metaphorical motivation to get out of this club and to start performing like Tyreek Hill does season to season. So now that we've had our first inductee into the Underachievers Club, let's go ahead and hop right in to our fantasy hot or not list. Welcome into another edition of our fantasy hot or not list, where I'm going to give you my starts and sits of the week for your fantasy football teams in the NFL. And of course, like always, we're starting with the hot, the sexy, the people we want on our team, the people we want to date this week, and have great matchups. It's our hot list. Let's get into it. We're starting with our running back position, as we always do. We're going with the Cleveland Browns running back, Nick Chubb, as he goes up against the New Orleans Saints. Now, with the bye week behind them, Cleveland Browns had a week to rest. The Browns will be well rested for their upcoming matchup against the Saints. Remember, they're kind of a dumpster fire, though they won this past week against, whoever they were playing. Now, that's the same Saints team that allowed Bijan Robinson to run over 100 yards and 2 scores last week. So they played the Falcons. Pretty good offensive team. But their rush defense, not so great. Now, that's the same defense that came into Week 10, surrendering the 6th most non-PPR fantasy points to the opposing running backs. Basically, Nick Chubb is set to have his breakout game of the season against the New Orleans Saints. So, my opinion, you're putting him in your lineup. He's hot this week. Moving on to our spicy wide receiver, we have Tennessee Titans wide receiver Calvin Ridley as he goes up against the Minnesota Vikings. Now, DeAndre Hopkins has departed from Tennessee. He's been traded away, which means that Calvin Ridley is now the number 1 guy in Tennessee. And he emerged as the serious threat in the Titans passing attack because last week he did pretty well for himself. He's now had 3 straight games with double-digit fantasy points, and in Week 11 he'll face the Vikings secondary that entered Week 10 surrendering the second most points in fantasy to opposing wide receivers. So not only has he emerged as the number 1 wide receiver in Tennessee, but he has emerged to be doing extremely well against defenses that will allow that. And, the Vikings, they're allowing second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So Ridley, it hurts me to say because I traded him away to Garrett, my boyfriend. You're hot this week, which means, babe, go ahead and put him in your lineup, and anybody else who has him, go ahead and put him there. Moving on to our tight end, we have a tight end that we haven't talked about too often. And it's because, I watched Monday Night Football and I was like, oh my gosh, he's still playing football? It's the Miami Dolphins tight end, Jonnu Smith, as they take on the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, heading into Monday Night Football, Smith had earned at least 6 targets in 4 straight games. He'd scored at least 6 PPR points in each of those games as well. And I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but tight ends who score points this season is kind of hard to come by. Now, speaking about the defense, the Las Vegas Raiders have been one of the worst teams in the NFL at defending the tight end position. So Smith has a solid floor with upside this week. 6 targets in, how many games now? That was 4 straight games. And against a defense that doesn't know how to defend the tight end position. Dolphins, Jonnu Smith, we're putting you in the lineup. Now, unfortunately, I have to move on to the players that are on our not list. Probably not dating them this week. Not as spicy. They've been hot before, but we're taking the heat off of them a little bit because their matchups don't look so great. Starting off with the Cincinnati Bengals running back Chase Brown as they go up against the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, this one is a hard one because he has emerged greatly this season. He is doing a phenomenal job. And especially because their second running back, Zach Moss, has been put on IR due to a neck injury. So Chase Brown will have a tough time producing against the Chargers defense that has allowed the second fewest non-PPR points to opposing running backs all season long. So they're going up against a really tough Chargers defense. But not only that, T. Higgins, the wide receiver for the Bengals, is expected to come back any week, and the Bengals could lean very heavily on the pass game against Los Los Angeles. So, Chase Brown, love you, buddy. You've been great, but this week we might have to put you on the bench just because the Chargers defense is that good. Now we're moving on to our wide receiver not so hot guy this week. Probably shouldn't put him on your bench. And we're talking about Green Bay Packers wide receiver Jayden Reed as they go up against their rival in division, the Chicago Bears. Let's talk about it. The Chicago Bears have been phenomenal at defending wide receivers this year. And while Jayden Reed has explosiveness to break through for a 40-plus yard reception at any moment, the Bears will be focused on the effort to limit his impact. If there's one thing that the Bears can do well, it's defend the wide receiver position this season. So, and I'm going to put on top of that the fact that they're not at Lambeau Field, they're at Soldier Field in Chicago. Although the Bears haven't been all that great, they're in their home stadium, and that's always, a notch up on the home team side. So Jayden Reed, go ahead and set this one out, buddy. It's going to be hard to start you this week. Now we're talking tight ends. And the tight end we're talking about is the Washington Commanders tight end, Zach Ertz. And the simple reason we're talking about him on the not list is because the Philadelphia Eagles, who they're going up against for Thursday Night Football, they're not great at defending the rush game, and they're not great at defending the pass game. Therefore, they're probably going to lean on their wide receiver, Terry McLaurin, and their running back, Brian Robinson Jr., and Austin Eckler a little bit more in this game to score their points. And it's simply because the best thing that the Eagles are good at defending, I guess, is the tight end position. And that's really it. It's nothing against Zach Ertz, and I know that he's really involved in the Commanders' offense. It will just be extremely hard to start him this week, knowing that Brian Robinson Jr. is probably coming back, and him and Austin Eckler and Terry McLaurin will probably be the star of the show in terms of scoring. So we've got our hot list, we've got our not list, and we've got our first inductee into the Underachievers Club, which is going to wrap up Week 11's episode of Her Game Plan's Fantasy Hot or Not list. Thank you so much for continuing to support the podcast. Go ahead, like, subscribe, comment, give a follow on social media. You can find us on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at Her Game Plan Podcast. And I just want to thank you all so much for continuing to listen. Go ahead and take the tips, apply them to your fantasy teams. If you don't have a fantasy team, get a conversation to start a league next year because, ladies, we are playing the field and owning the game, and not only in the NFL, but in fantasy football as well. I love you all. Good luck in your matchups this week, and I will see you in Week 12.